Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennie Mills. I'm a longtime reviewer for Library Journal, and I'm a public librarian in the suburbs of Chicago. I'm excited to be discussing 5 upcoming novels with everyone today. The novels are connected by stories centered around women with a sense of grief and loss, often carried through generations, but frequently there's a thread of redemption in them. Also, ghosts popped up more often than not. I'm here with Oyinkan Braithwaite, who many of us know from My Sister, the Serial Killer. Her new book, Cursed Daughters, is releasing in November of 2025 from Doubleday. The women in her book labor under a curse. No man will call your house his home, and if they try, they will not have peace. When Eben gives birth to her daughter, the day her cousin is buried, everyone in her family is convinced that the new baby is her cousin reborn. Curses are a lot of pressure for a family to bear. Jade Chang, whose witty upcoming novel, What a Time to Be Alive, is releasing from Ecco in September, finds a winning heroine in Lola Treasure Gold, who becomes an accidental wellness influencer in the wake of her accidental death of her best friend Alex. Chang's book explores both the depth and craziness of loss in the first year of grief, but the connectedness that can be found once people open themselves up to new experiences. Daley-Ward's book, The Catch, is the inaugural novel in the well-read Black Girl series, coming out from Liveright in June. Follows twins Clara and Dempsey with a fractious relationship ever since their mother took her own life in the Thames River, and they were taken in by 2 different families. Yet one day, Clara seems to spot their mother not having aged a day and childless. This is a book that profoundly explores both mother need and mother want. In the Wilderness, Angela Flournoy's upcoming release from Mariner in September, including a restaurateur, a librarian turned blogger, a woman pregnant with a good man's baby, a man who she's not actually sure she actually loves, and 2 sisters who are deeply divided, and follows all of these women's lives from the 1990s into the late 2020s, actually a little bit into the future, taking a look at as their lives shift and change. And then the final book that we're going to be discussing today is by Gish, her 10th book and her most personal yet, Bad Bad Girl, released in October. She blends fact with fiction and takes a look at her own mother's life. Since her mother, Agnes Jen, didn't leave that much written record behind, Jen had to reconstruct much of what must have been, resulting in a fictional novel that reckons with the generational trauma and the ties between mothers and daughters. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. We are going to start with just a basic general opening question, just to kind of give everybody a background. And I don't want spoilers. Spoilers kind of run it for everybody, but it does help to kind of start with just sort of the basic ground rules of a little bit of a tease for the. And I'm sorry, I'm going to speak with a really flat Midwestern accent, but I will do the best to pronounce everything. So I am an American with a Midwestern accent. Oyinkan, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit more about your book.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
Okay. All right. So speaking of the way we're talking, because I've got a bit of a cold, so if I sound weird, that's
Sorry.
why. Um, and also another disclaimer, I'm still sort of learning how to describe cursed daughters. So everyone bear with me. But I think, it's a book about the Faludu family. I mean, they're not just women in the family, but it's focused on the women in this family and generations of women who have been living under the auspices of this curse. So someone 5 generations ago was cursed, and all the women that have followed her were also cursed. So they've all been sort of dealing with the consequences of this curse. And we follow 3 characters. It's a multiple protagonist story. So we follow 3 women, Ebu, Munife, and Eni. Um, and they've sort of all been dealing with the curse in different ways. Munife, who uh, wants love, who wants to be able to beat the curse, who wants to be because as you said earlier, the curse is sort of this idea that the women are never going to be able to hold on to a man, with whether the man loves them or not. They're never going to be able to maintain this relationship. And she wants the love and she wants to be able to be the one to break this curse. Ebel, who sort of decided that she doesn't need a man and she will survive, but is has now got this daughter who is the spitting image of her cousin, and Eni, Ebon's daughter, who has been told all her life that she is the reincarnation of a woman she has never met. So that's kind of what I hope it gives. Yeah, I'm still working through describing this novel, but that's sort of what Cursed Daughters is about.
Okay. Okay. Jade. Lola is such a great character. I had such great fun reading about her. Tell me a little bit about her story.
Thank you. Hi, Jenny. Yes, so what a time to be alive. It goes through this extraordinary year in Lola Treasure Gold's life. It starts with a funeral. It's her best friend who she was kind of half in love with, dies in this really absurd way. And in the aftermath of that, Lola, I don't want to spoil it, but she kind of accidentally becomes part of this video that goes viral with footage of her friend's death, and then, which is horrifying, of course, and then footage of her talking as if she's a guru speaking to her followers. And she didn't mean it seriously, but people take it seriously and they start to follow her. And because she doesn't really know what else to do with her life, she decides to make it real. So she goes deep into the world of self-help gurudom, which I think I've been fascinated with ever since I went to TED and then I went to Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, and I realized that they're all kind of spinning the same semi-benevolent con. So we see Lola kind of grow her following. She sneaks into TED, she goes to Esalen, she runs around LA. And the whole time, the loss of her friend has also raised this like old wound, which is her mother came to America when she was pregnant with Lola, and she was fleeing China's one-child policy. But then she was deported when Lola was 8, and then her phone calls stopped sometime around the time Lola was in junior high. So basically we're with Lola throughout this year, kind of wondering if she can get it together, if she'll find her mother, if she'll let herself have a little bit of romance, and if she can go through all of this grief and still really love being alive in the world.
Yrsa, your characters hunger so much for their mother and their place in the world, and you can just kind of feel that ache coming from them. Give me a short sketch of your book.
Yeah, um, absolutely. So first, my name's not obvious, it's Yrsa, but everyone
Yes.
says
Okay.
Yrsa, but it's okay.
I know.
I always start with that because it just looks strange written down. But yes, this is the catch. So it's about two sisters, they're twins, they're called Clara and Dempsey, and they just have a tough time with each other, you know. They've always kind of struggled to relate to each other because as infants they were adopted separately. Their mother disappeared not long after their birth into the River Thames, and she was missing, presumed dead. So 30 years later, Clara sees a woman who looks exactly like their mother. They know their mother from the photos and from the newspaper clippings. And she sees her on the streets of London. But the catch is that this version of her, even though she has the same name, is the spitting image, everything, has aged not a day. So everybody is 30. So it seems that could be, if it's the same person, a version of their mother who's enjoyed a childless life, the way it might have gone if they'd never been born. So Clara and Dempsey, they can't agree on this. Dempsey thinks it's ridiculous, but it's just so uncanny. Dempsey thinks the woman's a con woman. Clara thinks it's her mother, and so it just it gets crazier and crazier until it builds up to this crescendo, and then we find out.
Angela, your book is sort of a panorama because it scopes from the past all the way up until the sort of even into the near future, um, and with multiple points of view and points in time. It sort of jumps in time even. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, so I started writing this book a little bit before in early 2016, and I really wanted it to kind of be a straightforward book about what I consider to be real coming of age, which is coming into like adulthood from like your 20s into your 40s, like coming into middle age when you're like a real grown up. Um, so I started writing, and I wanted it to kind of be like if there is a way to have like the friendship centered like warmth of Waiting to Exhale, but with like a more of a big social novel feel, like a Visit from the Goon Squad. Um, but then there was an election that happened that year that because I knew I wanted to write about the future. I wanted to write to like the end of the 2020s. My vision was from 2008 to 2028. There was an election that year that made me think that maybe I didn't know what was going to happen in the future. So it took some time for me to consider what would happen to this group of friends. It's four women, five if you count an estranged sister, who are living in New York and Los Angeles and are doing all of the other things that all of us have done over the past 20 years while also living in the strange and constantly changing political realities that we've all been living in the last 20 years. So that is essentially the wilderness. As you mentioned, there's a character who's a restaurateur. There's a character who is former librarian turned social justice, social media influencer. She's just like a pivot queen, essentially. And then there's a character who um, is just, maybe found a good man too early and didn't realize it was the right man for her. It wasn't the right man for her. And then there's a character who has dealt with a lot of loss her whole life, who is like very committed to this found group, this like found family. So the story is really multivalent and about their coming into real age, coming into middle age over 20 years.
Honestly, I feel like I've lived 20 years in the past week,
Yeah,
honestly.
that is also part of why the time jumps around because it feels like time is fake more and more every day.
Yeah, it really, really does. Gish, you are telling your mother's story in a fictional way, but I could tell that telling your mother's story was a very personal topic for you. Can you give me a broad brushstroke of her life and why you decided to tell it as fiction?
Yeah. First, let me say, I would like to recommend that all librarians out there think about having a book club where they have all of these books. They're so related. It's almost a little eerie. I don't know if you guys think
Yeah,
about
it really was. As I was reading it, it was like really easy to do
it's
these questions.
incredible, the curses, the trying to come into middle age. In my case, I think I'm a little bit older because I define middle age maybe as starting at 60. So I guess I had the delayed adolescence. In any case, but I just think that, and trying to come out from under some curse. My book is no exception. It is based on my mother's life. My mother lived an amazing life. She grew up in the 20s and 30s in Shanghai in a fantastically wealthy family. That was great in some ways, but of course she was a woman, and so it was a mixed blessing. My grandmother, among other things, smoked opium, as most society women did at the time. And moreover, she was kind of the ideal banker's wife. And what that meant was that, in any social gathering, she was in the background. She was not seen. She was known for her self-control. That meant that she had never been heard to laugh aloud her whole life. No one ever heard her laugh aloud. And then to her is born my mother. It's the 1920s, 1930s, so modernity is coming to China. My mother is rather a modern Chinese girl. And that means that she is loud, she is rambunctious, and she's educated, and that's quite a point of contention because my grandmother was illiterate. And I don't think, of course you would want to educate your girls, but I don't think people really realize what it means to the older generation, to have these girls empowered that way. So my mother goes to this international school. She gets all these ideas. She does not get along with her mother. She is my grandfather's favorite, however, which only making things worse. In any case, so bad are things with her mother that is why she comes to America. She comes to America to escape her mother. She comes never intending to go back, and she doesn't go back. And of course, as soon as she gets here, what does her mother do? Her mother cuts her off financially. So my mother, who had been fantastically wealthy, is now penniless in America in this strange land. She is told from the get-go that no one would ever marry her. Somehow she does manage to get herself married. And then she has 5 children. I am number 2. I have an older brother. He is the favored, first son. In Chinese culture, that's a big deal. He is the first son. All the family resources go to him. And then she has this daughter, me, who is a little bit like her, outspoken, rambunctious, educated, even more educated than she was. And of course, I am growing up in 1960s America. So as you imagine, peace and harmony ensue. That is my book.
Yes. More specific questions. A theme that popped up in all of these books is obviously that they're all centered on women and women's lives. Jade, Lola's voice was very clear and distinct, and even her bad choices seemed like her own choices. Was her voice always clear to you? Could you always hear Lola's voice in your head when you were writing the book?
First, that's very nice of you to say that even her bad choices are her own choices. I'm sure Lola would really appreciate it. No, I will say it was really hard for me to find this voice. My previous novel, The Wangs versus the World, that was written really in close third, and I'd never written fiction in first person before, but it felt like that was what I needed to tell this story. But it took me a really long time, like several attempts. I tried to write kind of the first chapter a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different voices. I feel like often it just felt too cute, kind of. And yeah, I finally went with a friend to her friend's kind of like half abandoned apartment in Ojai in like a strange oak grove. And it was very dilapidated in all sorts of confusing ways, but also fantastic because I think it took that kind of going completely outside of my world to be able to find that voice. Yeah. And
Okay.
can I also just say, Gish, I'm so excited to be on this panel with you and to read that book. And also, Mona in the Promised Land was the first book I had ever read by an Asian American writer.
Oh my God, I think I'm going to start crying.
I loved it so much.
I read your earlier novel too, and I loved it, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gish, why was, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm catching a cold too. Why was now the right time to write about your mother's life and to begin processing the effect that she had on your own life?
Yeah, my mother died during COVID, so that was certainly a part of it. I know a lot of these books are about grief. And for me, this is the way I grieved. This is the way I came to terms. So that was part of it. Another part of it is that, I'm quite a bit older than a lot of you guys, as Jade has alluded to. I've been around for a while. So this is my 10th book. And, that means that I'm at the point in my career where I realize, like, that word never comes up. Like, you can imagine the sentence, like, you never wrote about your mother, So I have written 9 books without writing about my mother. And I just thought, like, oh my God, at this point, I'm going to die too someday. And I don't really want to finish my whole career off without ever having written about the relationship which was really the most formative of my life, hard as it was. And so I sat down to do this thing that, I really frankly didn't think that I could do. I think that Jade is very eloquent on the subject of finding your voice. And, it would seem that after 9 books that that I wouldn't have so much trouble finding my voice. But honestly, with this book, I too struggled to find my voice, to find my way in. Even though, like I say, I've produced a few thousand words already. It's not that part is not so hard. I mean, I just wrote a piece about wild turkeys. I can rip that out in 5 minutes. This was something else entirely different.
Okay.
Hmm.
Oyinkan, your novel is told from the perspective of 3 different women. Do you see one of them as the central figure, or do they all share sort of an equal weight in driving the story forward?
Um, First of all, I want to say I agree with Gish that I've seen a lot of similarities. When Yrsa was talking about the mother who they see, it's sort of, I mean, I've got a character who her name is Annie, and she's supposed to be the reincarnation of her aunt. So she looks exactly like her aunt. Her mannerisms, a lot of the things they do are very, very similar. And she was in my head when I started writing the story, she was my main character. Annie wasn't her name then, but she was my main character. And it was supposed to be a first person point of view, but it just wasn't working. I've done first person before. I did it with my sister, the serial killer, but it just wasn't working for this. So I don't know. I left it for a bit. You kind of just keep trying things, and eventually, I decided to make it a multiple point of view. So when I wanted it to be first person, and I wanted it to just be Annie, it was supposed to follow her from childhood, and you still get to see her as a child, but just not in her point of view. You get to see her as a child in her mother's point of view, and hopefully see the trauma that comes from them thinking she's someone else. She grows up in this house with her mother, with her grand aunt, and with her grandma. And just to have these 3 women responding to her the way that they do because they think that she's Monife. Then we've got Monife's point of view, and by the time we're in Ebu's point of view and Ani's point of view, Monife is already dead, but we get to follow her and see sort of what she went through and how she ended up dead at the end. And, Ebu's point of view as well, being the mother of Ani and going through what she went through. So do they have equal weight in pushing the story forward? Maybe not, but I think it's close enough to equal weight. And to be honest, my dad's read it, and to him, I think Monife was the main character, and I could definitely see the argument for that as well. So I don't know, maybe readers will feel differently about who the main character is, but for the purpose of writing it, I kind of had Annie in my head.
Okay. Yrsa, your book is almost entirely centered on the 2 sisters and their mother, and their need for each other, and how hard that need can be. It takes us down some surprising paths, but I'm interested in how you think this speaks to women's lives.
Nearly didn't unmute myself then. I think- wow, I think that what I've been thinking a lot about that recently and just how much I think about my mother and grandma, who are both no longer here in this plane, but still very alive to me and very, they come to me in dreams, or like I'd be walking down the street and like see somebody with like a similar stature, and that longing will come up, and just as I age on this timeline, you know what I mean? I kind of like, I long for some of that. Oh, counsel, you know what I mean? I'm like, I thought things would be together by now, and then I'm like, no, the counsel would have been really nice, or maybe in a way I can embody it and do that for someone else, or maybe, who knows? But I do think as women, or anybody, as humans, the people that came before us, with every year that goes by, we kind of understand them a little more, even in their absence, and there's just so much that gets passed down, in lineages from woman to woman, and it's just something I didn't understand it as much until now, and I'm learning it a little more all the time, and I just think it's fascinating. even in the longing, in the grief and all of that, there's just something special there. So that's what I'm currently grappling with. So it's appearing in all my work, and that's how I think it speaks to women. I just think that, yeah, we're always learning in this life, aren't we? It's very annoying, but like
It is. You're right.
that's where I am.
Angela, your novel uses really four women as a points of view character, and then you've got Desiree's sister kind of pops in for a chapter. How did you settle on the multiple voices? You talked about it a little bit, but how did you kind of decide on the multiple voices again?
On the topic of voices, I just wanted to congratulate and affirm Jade really quickly. I mean, I've read What a Time to Be Alive, and first person, it's a real masterclass. You did it. As someone who is a first person hesitant, I was very impressed. I I really like a group. I really like multi POV novels, reading them. I don't know why I keep like torturing myself writing them as much, but I think that this one, particularly because it was about friendship, and one of the, I think, interesting thing about any sort of family structure, whether it's like chosen or, the one you're born into, is the way that over time you can be like sort of put into these roles, and then you become a different person, but sometimes other people just are refuse to accept it. And then you find yourself regressing when you're around them. But there also is just ways that you have these shared memories that are actually like hotly contested among one another about what actually happened. And so it felt like having the multiple POVs was the best way to show that, like the nature of friendship and a friend group and the way that people feel there is a hierarchy in the group, or there's not a hierarchy in the group, or just what people think is their place in this community or this network. It felt like a thing that everyone had to kind of be involved in. And as far as just the one chapter with the one sister, that is I think that was an act of generosity, maybe to the reader, just because estrangement is really difficult. And yeah, I don't want to spoil, but estrangement is emotionally just it's really difficult for people on both sides of it. And especially over time in the same way, it becomes sometimes unclear like what was the thing, what was the first thing, but we've committed to this is the way that we live our lives, which is separate. And I was really fascinated by that. And it felt like at a certain point, this person needed to have a little bit of a say.
That's fair.
Mhm.
Um, So about family was also a lot of these books included family and the dynamics about family. Tolstoy's famous line is, "All happy families are alike, and each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." Many of the books that we're talking about today have strong themes of generational trauma being carried forward. Gish, did your family or did your mother ever really talk to you about your grandmother, or was that part of Bad Girl's conjecture? What stories did your mother tell you about your grandmother or her family life growing up?
She said almost nothing. And I mean, I think this is the level of estrangement when Angela's talking about. I mean, it's, the level of estrangement is such. And one of the reasons there's so much conjecture in my book is because she said so little. She said a lot more about her father, very, very, very little about her mother. Which is, by the way, I think not unusual in Asian American families. I mean, they're, depending on the generation, the autobiographical impulse is not necessarily so salient in Asian culture. And I was just reading the memoir, Dear Memory by Victoria Chang. It's a lot about silence. And I think that sort of a lot of my experience growing up was about silence. But I did have some insight into my mother and what had actually happened after she died, and some letters surfaced. We don't have any of the letters that she wrote home because those were unfortunately all destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. But it turned out that my mother had saved the letters from home. And in those letters, you can see that her siblings were very anxious for her, especially to write to her mother. and my mother refused through the Cultural Revolution, through the Great Famine, through all of it. China was just in incredible turmoil, and her family was going through hell. And through it all, my mother refused to write to her mother right until her death. Her mother died, never having heard from her again. And I think that that was that was the novelist's insight into. On one hand, I don't know what happened, and another way, I know something happened.
Right.
And so it's not like a retelling of all the stories my mother ever, my mother told me. This is a telling of all the stories my mother didn't tell me.
Yrsa, Dempsey and Clara can barely stand to be in the same room together. And the first time that Clara and the woman that they think might be the mother are together, they get in a physical fight. But they all seem to long for each other's love too. What is the glue that holds them together and pulls them apart?
Wow, I think there is something in family that both, compels you to move forward, and also you have that resistance there, they repel you as well. They're the people that probably, particularly in the early part of your life, the you know them the most intimately, I guess, and then you kind of don't. And I think playing with that, because all things, because so many things are in conflict, so many things are two things, there's always this two things can be true thing, particularly with the push and pull of, even in friendships, in relationships, you can love and be repelled by, you can desire and feel disgust. And I wanted to be really honest about that, how that appears. But people that you're supposed to love the most, it kind of that's there as well. It's kind of underpins it, and I just wanted to be really honest about it, and just also how we look at our siblings, siblings that are seemingly doing well, siblings that are seemingly doing worse, where we place that, and that real judgment that can cloud you when dealing with them, that other people wouldn't see. So yeah, I wanted to be honest about that, but also be honest about that real, that love, that thing that's underneath it all, it's just there, whether you like it or not. So that's what I wanted to speak to. And similarly with a parent, like I have experienced that as well. When a parent, they still, that role it still exists, whatever the relationship is there, and then there's something that kind of needs to be filled that's there as well. So even though this woman has been gone all their life, the very real need that there is for her,
Yes.
or someone like her.
Oyinkan, Monifa greatly grieves deeply over a loss, and yet her mother responds coldly to that loss. What do you think the novel is suggesting about how our own pain is received or overlooked by those closest to us?
Yes, so I think within my family, and also like with friends, like watching the community in Nigeria, um, mental health is a conversation that's coming up more and more. And in my life, I feel like I've been surrounded by women who sympathize with you and empathize with you, and then it comes to a point where they're like, okay, get up, you're done, you're done, whatever it is that you are, it's time to shoulder on, because life doesn't necessarily give you the grace to, doesn't give you the time to heal at your leisure. And to be honest, I've probably been guilty of that myself with other people. And I think it's born of, it's what it's a sort of kindness, it's a sort of abrasiveness, but at times it can also be akin to cruelty and dismissiveness. And um, I think that's kind of what I wanted to show in that in that moment between Monife and her mother, but also, there are loads of little hurts, and that all the women are sort of doing to one another. They're all causing trauma to one another. They're all overlooking one another's pain. It isn't, that moment was kind of deep. I don't want to spoil it, but it isn't just this woman that's guilty of it. They've all done it in lots of different ways. And I think that, as you said, in a family, things are constantly evolving, things are constantly changing. And one minute this person can be your best friend, and the next minute they're your enemy, but you still have that love for them. So yeah, I don't know if if I did it the best way, but that's what I was sort of going for.
Cool. Angela, your book includes two sisters who never really reconcile, and then three friends of Desiree. Um, how do friends become more family than actual family? How does that happen? Is that healthier?
I am really interested in this. I think that it is something that has just been kind of like germane to my life. My grandmother died when my mother was 10. So there were in her life she had like a hunger for sort of other mother figures. And also, she was one of four daughters, and she also just really, I think, always valued sisters. So was always interested in making other ones. So some of the closest people in my life growing up were not actually like blood aunties, but I didn't know that for a very long time. It's something that, especially in African American culture, is pretty common. This like concept of fictive kin, and it's something that I think now people use the kind of language of like chosen family. And I know that that's really important, especially like in the queer community. But it is something that has been happening in different ways for different reasons for a long time. But I wanted to see what it looked like now for my generation. How and why are people making families out of people who are not necessarily like, blood relatives? And I think some of that has to do with the fact that people are just moving away from their families for work, or they go to school and they don't come back, et cetera. And some of it might have to do with like ideological or political rifts. But it seems to me that it's really interesting because it is not, the obligation is something you continuously opt into. You opt into it with everyone. I try to remind my friends who like have difficult family life with people they are like blood related to. I'm like, you still are choosing. Like you choose, but there is not that feeling, that deep feeling of like, if I don't do it, no one will. The assumption with friends is that somebody else will, but that's not necessarily true. And I think especially as we get older, we realize that these people, I think especially a lot of women and queer people, you realize that these people that are in your life every day, they're in your life every day, and it matters that they're in your life every day, and that you don't just put them down. And just because you opted in doesn't mean that, you just kind of keep the opt-out button like right there and ready, and that you do try to grow with these people. And I think it's beautiful. And so that's just something that I thought was, I mean, we don't see enough of, I think, in literature, compared to like the sort of wealth of traditional family, like literature is out there. So and I think that's something also that is meditated on in Jade's book. Not that I'm just here to plug Jade's book, but I really loved it. So.
You've got your own book to plug. Jade, Lola decides after finding her biological half-brother that she no longer really wants to search for her biological mother, who left her behind after being deported. Why does this act start to give her peace?
She may be lying to herself just a little bit. And that kind of happens near the end of the book, and we don't really know, what the next year might bring. But also I just want to take issue for a moment with the Tolstoy quote. I think that and it's related to this. I do think that we kind of tell ourselves that happiness is not worth examining, but I think it is so worth examining. It is actually the thing that we are so deeply concerned with. And it was something that I feel like that has always been a theme I've been interested in. And in this book, very much, I was interested in kind of like how someone finds happiness in the face of all of this, in the face of everything that happens in the world, in the face of all all of this grief that she's currently going through. So yeah, and Angela, thank you so much. I have not yet been able to read Angela's book, but she blurbed my book, so it's very nice of her to continue to.
So
Yes.
now you know what you're doing this weekend, right? You're reading
Oh,
Angela's book.
I just got it. I just had my publisher send it to me, so it is on my shelf, ready to be read. Yeah.
Um, so
Mhm.
even though these books are very much centered on women's stories, there's still space for men and in their lives. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing can be debated. But um, Oyinkan, this a novel often feels like a chronicle of how men hurt women in these families, but yet we're still, as readers, we still find ourselves rooting for all the different couples in these books. How did you navigate the tension between the couples? There's couples for all of the women, really, in these books. So how did you navigate that tension? Oh, you're still muted.
My bad. It was gonna happen eventually. Yeah, so I think that the men do hurt the women, but the women are also flawed. These are not like simpering virgins, or I don't know if that's the right phrase to use for this, but they're not, they're not innocent as well. And um but when I was writing sort of the romances between the blossoming relationships, I guess, between Munife and Golden Boy and Indy and Zuby, I kind of shut that whole other mess out and focused on building these relationships, because romance isn't really, I don't read a lot of romance. I do read some, but it's not the genre I read a lot, and it was terrifying. I'm more gifted when it comes to breaking down relationships in my writing. I'm better um at that sort of trying to work out hostility, all those little fun things. So having people meet and fall in love, and uh, just I mean, romance authors, they have to be given their props, because it's also, I think the thing about this is a little bit of a side note, but I think the thing about writing a romance is it's kind of been done. Like we all, it's the script is there, but to be able to do it and make it fresh each time for the reader is a fantastic, I think, gift. So I really that was probably the hardest part, because curses I could do all day, but um building that love and trying to make it, I mean, we'll see if people found it believable, but try to make it at least engaging and wanting the reader to want these couples to make it was challenging. But writing isn't fun if it doesn't challenge you. So we'll see. We'll see. Hopefully, when people get a chance to read it, we'll see how they feel about all of that.
Thank you. Gish, I know this is a work of fiction because you had to do so much conjecture, but your fictional dad and fictional Gish seem to have a lot less friction between them than you and your fictional mother did. Was Norman aware that there was a lot of that disparity, that you got along better with him than you did with your mother?
Well, so, before I answer your question, let me just go back to what Oyinkan was saying, and about, you're really talking about genre fiction and
Yeah.
and I have to say, I am, quote unquote literary writer. The book before this, was a dystopia. I was also looking to the future. Unfortunately, everything I thought I was writing about 40 years out, but unfortunately, it's all come true 5 years after pub. That book was called The Resistors. It was a post-automation surveillance state feminist baseball dystopia, and but in it, because I was writing basically a baseball novel, it's like a lot like writing a romance. For the first time, I was actually, dealing with the kind of genre, like, there had to be a big game at the end. And, and I was surprised at how hard it is to do. So hats off to you. It is much harder than you would think. So those of us normally on the other side of this, we think, oh, there's a formula, it's easy. Quite the contrary. To make it fresh is a whole new thing. And then to go back to your question, Jennie, yes, my father was aware that, there was tension between me and my mother, but there's also tension between him and my mother, So I was his favorite daughter, and and of course, this is, I think a lot of our books are about kind of trying to break out of these patterns, But weirdly, just as my mother was her father's favorite and way too brainy for, for her role or whatever, I was my father's favorite, way too brainy for my role. And the same way I think that I can, extrapolating, I can see that, her mother and her father had their issues. My mother and my father had their issues. And just as she was kind of triangled in, I was triangled in. And so, I think that, and interestingly, to your point, Angela, about friends, we will tend to bring these patterns to our friendships too. We have our new chosen families, and we do it all over again. And I mean, I hope I actually hope that I've broken some of these patterns, but of course the first step is always seeing them. And I will say that seeing the stuff in fiction is often a great help, and because you read it and it's so obvious on the page, but things are very obvious on the page that are not so obvious in life.
Angela, your book doesn't get into men women roles as much, but January, you've got the character that kind of found the good man a little early. Would she have settled as early if she hadn't gotten pregnant, do you think, or was that what the settling point?
Absolutely not. I think that for me, it was important to see her character kind of acknowledge the retrograde situation she found herself in, which is, I am pregnant with a man that like is fine, but I don't love, but I'm like afraid to do it by myself, especially a person who is very underemployed, like an artist, just the real sort of practical fears that she had. I didn't think that it didn't seem like an old-fashioned thing to be thinking about, because the reality is you still have to think about, how am I going to feed this child? So it felt like honest to her, for her to have to actually really grapple with what does it mean to try to do this by myself, like for real by myself. And she goes from thinking, oh, I want to do it completely by myself, like I want him to sign away his rights so I never have to see his face again, to being like, should I just get married because he's fine? And having to sort of come somewhere in the middle of that is like a journey that I think she would have been embarrassed to be on until she was on it, and she just realized that's just life. She just had to.
Yeah. Jade, Alex may have been the soulmate for Lola, but he was also the platonic friend and not at the same time. How did that change the dimension of grief? Because there had been the possibility of more, but it hadn't really gotten there yet.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that the loss of potential is
Yeah,
always
just a little bit left, so quick.
Oh yeah, that's it. The loss of potential is always the most gutting thing. And so I think that was definitely like a huge component of her grief, for sure.
And Yrsa, I think we're gonna have to leave your last question goodbye. I'm so sorry.
That's
But it was
okay.
okay. It was fabulous talking to all of you. Library Journal very much appreciates all of this great discussion. We had a great time. I really enjoyed talking to all of you, and I hope you had a great time talking to all of each other too. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can't
It
wait
was
to read
Thank
all
you,
of your
amazing.
books.
everybody.
Me too.
Good
Lovely
luck.
night, everyone.
Bye.